If you are curious about astrology but feel overwhelmed by the complexity and just don't even really know where to start and are looking for some grounding in the foundations, just basic astrology 101, what is it? How does it work? What can it do? This is a video for you. My name is Aleena and welcome to Promethea Astrology. I am the astrologer for creatives and change makers with a physics BS from Yale. Let's get right into it. My learning objectives for you today that I hope that you will be able to do by the end of this video are to be able to define astrology, identify at least two things that astrology can do, and define what a birth chart is. So what is astrology? Astrology is an art, a science, a system of symbolic thinking using astronomical bodies. So it is a science in the sense that it is using astronomy. We are using the mathematically calculated pathways of the planets through their orbits around the sun. Originally, there was no difference between astrology and astronomy, and all of our astronomical learning and scientific discovery was motivated by astrological thinking and knowledge. So originally, there really was no difference between the science of astronomy and the system of symbolic thinking and subjective meaning and interpretation of astrology. So it has this kind of quantitative reasoning that is the foundation of it all, but it also has all of this symbolic meaning. So astrology is really like a language that you can speak, a symbolic language, using astronomical bodies as symbols. And the language of astrology is quite poetic, as it is based in symbolism and is quite abstract, which is why it can get really confusing really quickly for people, because there's so many different pieces and there's so much layer and nuance that you can bring to everything. But I'm gonna try to keep this really just bare bones, basic, what is it today? So the fundamental assumptions of astrology I think are really important to get into. This is sort of all of the premises that astrology is based on, from which we derive our understanding, our delineations, our interpretation of what things mean. So these are sort of the assumptions that astrologers share to some degree. There is a correlation between celestial movements and earthly events. This is the most basic. If nothing else, pretty much all astrologers will agree on this one. And this one goes back as far as astrology does. The most ancient original astrology that was happening was simply people observing the stars and noticing things that were happening on Earth and making connections between that. It actually was not until maybe 1,000 years or more from the oldest record of astrological thinking that we have, that is written down in human history, that we start to have birth charts and this idea of a horoscope. So the most ancient, original, basic premise of astrology is just that things that are happening in the sky, the movements of the planets, are correlated to things that are happening here on Earth. Second assumption that I have here is that astronomical bodies and points carry archetypal significance. So each of the different symbols or bodies or points in space that are represented in a birth chart and in astronomy have symbolic archetypal significance. This is what we are working with as we are speaking the language of astrology. The visual experience of astronomical movements from our subjective experience has symbolic meaning. And this is the point where people get caught up sometimes, because there was a point in human history, in astrological history, where we didn't really have clear boundaries between the subjective and the objective. So for instance, when humanity discovered that the sun is the center of the solar system and not the earth, it is not that everything revolves around the earth like we used to think, but actually the sun is the center. This changed a lot in astrological thinking, because prior to this, we were thinking, for instance, a retrograde, when it looks like a planet is moving backwards in the sky, that star is actually moving backwards. But in fact, if you are seated on the planet Mercury as he's going retrograde, if you were on Mercury going along his path in his orbit, he's not actually moving backwards. The planet Mercury is not actually moving backwards. The planets only move forward, but because of our spot in the solar system, because of the different distances each planet is from the sun, it looks like things are happening that are not actually happening from a more objective, godlike, observational point of view. So for astrology, it's important that we understand that our interpretation of things is not coming from this objective, godlike point of view, but rather it's extremely important to understand that all of the meaning that comes out of astrology is from our subjective point of view, that the way things look to you from your specific point in space, from your specific point in times, has symbolic meaning. So even if Mercury is not actually moving backwards when he goes retrograde, the fact that it appears that way to us affects us. Similarly, the moon is never actually gone from the sky. A new moon does not mean the moon disappears. The moon is always being the moon in her full self, her full bodied self. But from our perspective, it looks like there's no moon. And that is significant symbolically and has an effect on us because of the way that we are seeing things from our point of view. This is more of my personal language that I think is helpful to name in astrological thinking that I think many astrologers would agree with. Maybe not all of them, but the way that I think it makes sense to interpret astrology is to say that time has a quality. So the moment that something comes into existence is somehow imprinted with the quality of that moment that has something to say about its character and its destiny. So rather than time being like some one-dimensional linear thing that is just a unit that happens 1 second after another, it is that, but it also has this felt quality. It is not just quantitative time, but it is also qualitative. And astrology gives us a system to measure and predict what the quality of a moment will be. And the assumption that you are sort of required to make to get into some of these different astrological techniques requires that we understand that the moment that something comes into existence is somehow carrying the quality of that moment of time that somewhat, to some degree, defines the character, the nature, the disposition of that thing for the rest of its life, and also can give us a look into what might happen in this thing's future. But all of that is related to the quality of the time that that thing comes into existence, which could be a person, or it could be a business, or it could be anything. Anything that has an origin can have a birth chart, a bridge, it doesn't matter. So then what is an archetype? If we say that there is archetypal significance to the astronomical bodies in the sky, what does that mean? So there are many different ways to understand archetypes. I think most people first encounter this word in a literary context, understanding archetypes as like characters in a story or sort of foundational character types that you see in many different narrative structures. There's a rich history of understanding this word. To keep it within the astrological context, in the most ancient sense that we have record of in human history, we see that people are understanding the planets as gods. So being a god or goddess is sort of one version of thinking about an archetype. This is sort of the most ancient version of archetypal thinking. So for instance, Mars, the planet Mars, has this energy of war, aggression, violence, assertion, splitting, severing, kind of the archetype of war in a sense, and conflict. So originally, people conceptualized these stars as gods, and eventually the Greeks came to assign the planet Mars the god Ares. But even before this, people were still thinking of planets as gods. And they sort of had the fullness and character of a humanoid god that was just in this other sky realm, but still had flaws and complicated relationships and was sort of closer to human-like nature. And by the time we get to Plato, he sort of evolves this thinking into what he calls forms, or what some people now call Platonic ideals. So Plato had this idea that there's this other realm, this realm of forms, where there is the most perfect essential version of any given thing. For instance, a human is not something that you can ever really encounter as a category. So, I'm a human, you're a human, but none of us individually can really define or encapsulate the totality of what it means to be a human. So Plato's idea in this realm of forms, there is some like essential archetypal human essence that you can never completely wrap your head around or grasp, because it's sort of like a category. It's like the more abstracted version of a thing. So there could be, in this planetary sense, some perfect version of the archetype of war and Mars's energy, or the god Aries, but it's no longer like this humanoid god figure, but rather like this other realm where the most perfect essential nature of a thing exists, that all of our earthly material manifestations are sort of reflections of, if that makes sense. And then fast forwarding a couple millennia, we have philosopher, psychologist Carl Jung, who sort of took this idea of Plato's forms and archetypes and birthed archetypal psychology. Many astrologers are a big fan of Carl Jung and really resonate with his work. And in fact, Carl Jung himself admitted that he was quite interested in astrology and would often look at the horoscopes or birth charts of his clients. And we have written evidence for this, which is fascinating. So Carl Jung did this work to uncover the collective unconscious. He was very interested in dreams as well and symbolism, and did a lot of research to sort of look into and uncover what archetypes were present across cultures, across time, finding that there were many sort of essential archetypal figures that people were encountering in dreams, even from different places and different points in time. Even back in history, when people and places didn't share a culture, there were still similar archetypal figures that would show up, which is curious, isn't it? So Jung postulated that perhaps there is sort of this other realm where there are these archetypes and these volitional entities that interact with us in dreams, and also we end up projecting onto different people and symbols. So rather than the planetary energy archetype coming from this realm of forms like Plato postulated, Carl Jung gave us this idea that there's something called the collective unconscious. There's this sort of psychological realm that everyone can be tapped into or is tapped into to different degrees, where there are these psychological impulses and instincts, similar to the way that we have physical, biological impulses and instincts. There's also psychological impulses and instincts. And these are like the different archetypal energies that come through us that we can sometimes even be possessed by. And so in astrology, we can think of the different planets as like these different psychological functions, psychological instincts. And that's the way astrology sort of came back into vogue in the 20th century. It had sort of been on decline since the rise of Christianity and the scientific revolution. But in the 20th century, we had Carl Jung bringing this psychological, archetypal psychology into the field, and astrologers sort of picking this up and connecting the dots and re-understanding astrology through the psychological lens. And now we're in a moment where we are having like a traditional revival in astrology, which is what I'm a part of. I'm a Hellenistic astrologer. So in, I think, maybe the 80s or 90s, we started to uncover very ancient texts that had never been translated or hadn't been translated in many, many centuries. So we were getting all of these ancient timing techniques and ancient wisdom of how ancient astrologers were practicing. And then people started to pick that up and apply these techniques, and we have a whole new synthesis going on where we are still mostly aware and connected to this psychological framing where astrology can be viewed as sort of a map of the psyche, but also now that we have these ancient texts being recovered, we can also look into this more ancient understanding of astrology where it is certainly connected to character, but also can tell us about the external world that you might encounter as well, and things that happen outside of you, which I'm very interested in. So to get a little bit more specific and a little bit out of that more kind of grandiose, philosophical, mystical framing of astrology, to bring it down to earth a little bit more, the planets in the birth chart, you could think of them as different parts of yourself. So like I was saying, like these psychological instincts, for instance, Mercury is our communication, Mars is our drive to take action, Venus is our impulse to love and relate and connect and look for beauty and harmony, and the sun is the ego and the moon is the unconscious. So there's this psychological framing that we can look at where each planet sort of represents a different aspect or part of the self. We can also look at the planets through this more traditional lens. Sometimes, depending on where they're located in the chart, they can actually represent other people. For instance, the 7th house is related to the marriage partner, the spouse. And so planets here can sometimes represent the actual spouse or person that you may end up marrying. And the 4th house is the place for parents. So placements here can relate more to energy of the parents and so on. And then sometimes the planets, again, depending on the placement, can represent types of experiences that you might encounter. So for instance, the 10th house is related to career and vocation. So planets that we find here can sometimes relate to the type of work you do or the type of fortune that you have regarding career and vocational things. And not every chart placement is active all the time. Maybe in this one level, there's sort of the psychological piece of it that's more or less omnipresent, but sometimes the chart can also represent certain experiences that you will have in your life that are finite, where maybe you have this one experience in this one particular point in time when that placement is activated using one of many different astrological timing techniques, and it plays out. So there's many different ways to interpret the archetypal significance and meaning of the different astrological, astronomical symbols in the birth chart. So now we can look at what actually is a birth chart. What a birth chart is a map of the sky the moment that you were born. So in astrology, we can look at not just a birth chart, but the chart for the sky at any given point in time and place for any particular reason. So like I was saying, this could be the birth chart of a YouTube video or of a business or of a bridge or a house, the moment you built a house, or a person. Or you can look at the birth chart to just get a sense of the moment in time that you're in, even if nothing is coming into existence in that moment, just to sort of get a temperature check of what is the vibe of this moment. That is what the birth chart is here to tell us. So we can see here, the outer circle here includes the different symbols and points of the birth chart. And then inner circle, the first circle after that, this is the zodiac signs. And then inside of there, we have the different houses. And then inside of there, we have the different aspects. And this point here, the ascendant, is the eastern horizon, the western horizon, the MC, the point directly overhead, and the IC, the point directly below. So I'll get more in depth about what all of this means in a little bit, but I thought it would be good to just get a picture in your head for what a birth chart looks like and what the symbol of astrology is, and you can start imagining it as I mention these different things. So one more time, outer circle here are the planets and points in the sky out in space. Inner circle here, this is the zodiac, different zodiac signs. Then we have the houses, these numbers 1 through 12, and all of these lines, the different aspects or relationships between the planets. So to give us a sense of the symbolic nature for what this means and how we can make sense of these different components, I find the ancient understanding of the astrology to be very helpful and intuitive. So these are the 4 pillars that I just mentioned: the zodiac signs, the houses, the planets, and the aspects. And the way that ancient astrologers understood these 4 pillars was as if the sky was its own world. So in the sky world, there are these 12 kingdoms, which are the zodiac signs and the houses. Because I am an ancient Hellenistic astrologer, I use ancient Hellenistic house systems where the zodiac sign is the same size, shape, and place as the house. So the zodiac signs and the houses together make up the kingdoms in this sky world. And each of the different kingdoms is like a country where it has its own culture, its own personality. It has a certain way of being that is more natural and intuitive to it in a different area of life that it is responsible for. And then the planets are literally, etymologically, this means wandering star. So from an ancient perspective, they did not understand that the planets were planets. They only saw what looked like a star that was moving, whereas all the other stars seemed to be still. But there were these seven stars that seemed to move around. So these were like the kings of the different kingdoms in this mythology, in this metaphor. So there are these wandering characters that traverse around the sky world, the planets, and sometimes they find themselves somewhere that is particularly supportive of their nature, that is natural and intuitive for them, and sometimes they find themselves in places that are particularly difficult or more challenging. And each of the planets is like the king or queen of one of these 12 kingdoms. So if the king or queen finds themselves in the sign of its place of rulership, when the king is in his kingdom, this is a very nice thing. It's in a place that supports the planet's nature, that is in alignment with the type of energy that it wants to bring into the world. But the planets can also find themselves in places that are particularly difficult or antithetical to their nature, that want to do or have tendencies that are opposite to what they would like to bring to your life and to the world. So this depends on the time and place of your birth. And then lastly, we have the aspects, which are like the relationships between the characters. So are the characters getting along? Are they helping each other out? Or are they in conflict? Are they fighting against each other? This will relate to the angular distance between them, the aspects. So to ground ourselves in the astronomy a little bit more, because this is very helpful to understand how this all works and makes it a little bit more intuitive to understand the kind of symbolic meaning that we are deriving from the astronomical situation of the chart. So there are these 4 angles that are the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, and the IC. So these are the points that anchor us in the sky. So like I mentioned earlier, the ascendant is the place on the eastern horizon. The descendant is the place on the western horizon. The IC is the place directly below us, if you could dig a hole to the other side of the planet. And the MC is what would be directly overhead. So this is why it's important to have the birthplace and time, because the eastern horizon in Australia will be very different from the eastern horizon in Philadelphia. So this is giving us a map of where the planets are from our specific point of view. So what is above the sky for me will be different from what is above the sky for someone in the southern hemisphere, for instance. This is another really confusing piece of the astronomy because this is very complicated to imagine many different spheres floating through space, orbiting around the sun, plus the Earth's rotation, plus your particular place on the planet. It's pretty complicated, but I'm going to do my best to break it down for us. So the angles, the points on the eastern and western horizon, what is directly above and below, these will make a full rotation in 24 hours because that's how long the day is. So the Earth will rotate all the way around in 24 hours, and this is our cycle of day and night. And the entire sky that is around us will, seemingly from our point of view, be rotating around with us as we on Earth are spiraling in Earth's rotation. And the angles are also what determine the houses. So both the angles and the houses will make a full rotation in 24 hours. So what this means is that because there are 12 signs, 24 divided by 12 is 2, about every 2 hours, the zodiac sign that's on the eastern horizon will change because 1/12 of the Earth's rotation will be complete in about 2 hours. So there's a way in which we have this daily rotation happening. And in addition to that, we also have the orbit of the planets through the zodiac, through their orbit. Whereas the zodiac signs are more or less fixed because these are part of the realm of fixed stars, the stars far out in space, not the planets. But the planets that are nearby are actually moving around in their orbit, so they will change place in the zodiac. So the rising sign, the point on the eastern horizon, will change about every 2 hours, but the moon, for instance, takes about 28 days to go through the zodiac to complete her orbit. So she will also change signs once every 2.5 days. So not only is the moon rotating around us in the cycle of day and night, but also moving through her orbit around the Earth. Similarly, the sun takes about 4 weeks to travel through one zodiac sign and switch signs. So hopefully this is giving you sort of a sense of the landscape, the lay of the land, what's happening, the story that's unfolding that we are interpreting symbolically through the movements of the Earth and the planets. Also, probably important to note that in astrology, a planet includes the sun and the moon and also Pluto. But the 7 traditional planets do not include Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto because those are not visible to the naked eye. Those were not discovered until after the 18th century. So, from an astrological point of view, the 7 planets that are closer to us that we can see with the naked eye sort of represent more of the personality and what is a part of your character. And the outer planets still do have an impact, but it's more collective. Also, because they're so far away, they take much longer to change signs. The moon takes 2.5 days to change sign. Pluto takes about 20 years to change sign. So everyone within about a 20-year time span will have the same Pluto sign. So that particular sign placement is not so unique to your personality. To take it back a little bit to more basics, we're getting kind of in the nitty gritty now of things, but maybe it's important to also note that many people don't even necessarily understand that different planets have different signs. So in our solar system, there are 7 traditional planets, 3 outer planets, depending on who you ask, and 9 or 10 planets in our solar system. And in astrology, your sun sign is the sign where the sun was at the time of your birth. So we can see that the sun is going to be moving around the zodiac. It'll take a full year for the sun to get all the way around. and when he is in or near a certain constellation, that is the zodiac sign that he is assigned to. So you have not only a sun sign, but also a moon sign, a Mercury sign, Venus sign, Jupiter sign, Saturn sign, all the things. And each of these represent sort of a different aspect of who you are, a different part of yourself, and give us different information about the type of character and life that you might live. And then in this particular chart, there is a difference between the letters in the outer circle that are gray versus these symbols that are solid white. So the symbols that are white, these are actually physical bodies that exist out in space, whereas these gray symbols and these gray letters are not physical bodies, but instead points in space that are determined mathematically. So for instance, the ascendant again is the eastern horizon. So there's not necessarily any planet on the eastern horizon. It's just a point in space that can be determined mathematically. And the MC is the point directly overhead. So it does not necessarily mean that there's anything physically existing there as far as planets or bodies. It's just a point in the sky for us that is significant to interpret symbolically. So in addition to the planets on this particular chart, I also have listed here the nodes, which is the ecliptic, the lot of fortune, and that's pretty much it. But there are more physical bodies like asteroids you could put on here, and there are more angles that you could include here, like different lots and the vertex and things like that. So different astrologers use a different number of symbols to interpret. So for me and my perspective, especially as more of like a beginner talk, there's so much that you can get out of just the planets alone with nothing else. So I prefer to kind of pare it down. There's really no limit to the amount of different bodies and nuance that you can add to things. Things can get incredibly subtle and complex, but I think it tends to be more powerful and potent to just focus in on the things that are going to be the most felt, which the deeper you get into astrology, the more you can start to add in and layer on these different components, more angles, more asteroids, things like that. But especially at the beginning, I think it's better to focus on just the planets, the signs, the aspects, the houses. And if you wanted to go deeper, then I would suggest that you start learning with each of the planets, which you can watch one of my videos about that if you're interested. Or if you're more of a reader, you could read books and then get into each zodiac sign and then the houses and then the aspects. That tends to be the order that is good to build on for learning. So the last piece that I want to sort of give us to really ground in this is a little bit of context around the zodiac, because people who are skeptical of astrology love to bring up the fact that the zodiac is not where it was at the point of its origin. So at the beginning, when the zodiac was conceptualized, the constellations, the constellation Gemini, the constellation Cancer, the constellation Scorpio, the zodiac signs are named after these constellations. And originally, the constellation was at the point in the sky where that zodiac sign was assigned. Now, 3,000 or 4,000 years later, we have this thing called precession, where the Earth's axis actually wobbles a little bit. So now the zodiac, the tropical zodiac, is no longer aligned with the constellations. It's shifted almost a complete sign over. So you can see in this little graphic that I have here how much the signs have changed. So this is Aries originally, and then this is Aries now. So almost a full sign over. Another interesting and important thing to note is that the constellations are also not exactly 1/12 of the sky. So for instance, Virgo is actually a very big constellation and Cancer is a very small constellation. So the zodiac does not actually map onto the size and shape and present place of the constellations. So instead, the tropical zodiac, which I use as a traditional astrologer, has to do with the equinoxes. So Aries is the first part of spring. That starts at the spring equinox. Cancer is the summer solstice. That's when Cancer season starts. Libra is the beginning of fall at the fall equinox, and Capricorn is the beginning of winter at the winter equinox. And then the mutable signs are in the middle of each of those seasons, and the cardinal signs are at the end of each of those seasons. So rather than being aligned with the constellations, the tropical zodiac is aligned with the equinoxes and has more to do with the solar cycle and seasons. And I think this makes sense to use, of course, because that's what I'm using, but also because even if you don't believe in astrology, I would be hard pressed to find someone who doesn't feel affected by the seasons at all. The length of the days changing, the warmth and the coolness. We are very affected by the solar cycle. And there's much of the symbolism for these different zodiac signs is actually derived from the season that they're in. So Aries being the spring equinox, the beginning of spring, has this big initiating energy. Aries is the warrior. It's bursting forth. It is the life that's coming through the ground. It is the seed breaking from its shell and piercing through the ground as it grows. This is the energy of Aries and also of spring. And this continues throughout the zodiac. So one of my missions as an astrological teacher and educator is to get people fluent in reading astrology as a two-dimensional symbol rather than a one-dimensional linear list of placements, which I think many apps are now giving people their information in this way, where you just have a list of each of the planets and a list of the zodiac sign that they're in. But it is so much richer and deeper and complex than that. And when you're able to really read an astrology chart, when you're able to read a horoscope, is what it's called, the chart of a moment. When you're able to read a horoscope as a holistic symbol, you're able to use both the left and right side of your brain at the same time. So reading through a list, this is a very left brain way of thinking, but looking at a symbol in its fullness is more of a right brain thing to be able to see an image completely. And there's so much that you receive from this visual experience of the birth chart. It would be like trying to appreciate the beauty of a tapestry by looking at one thread at a time rather than stepping back and looking at the totality of the imagery in the tapestry. It allows you a point of access that is deeper within yourself. You're able to really kind of sidestep some of the ego grip when you look at things symbolically rather than through words and reading one line after another. And there's so much that you get visually when you see the lines and the way things are connected and how close they are. So I'm a big proponent of learning how to look at the chart and read it as a symbol. So much of the work that I do in my teachings is helping people to be able to do that. And then to close, I think it's important to touch on what astrology actually does. So what are we doing? What are we doing with all of this information? So there's many different schools of astrology. There's many different ways people have of talking about and understanding what astrology can do, and different astrologers will have different opinions about what it's capable of and not capable of. So I can speak to what I believe in, but you may find a different answer from someone else. So astrology can tell us about the psyche, the character, who you are. It can help us understand where you will probably have strengths in your life and where you might potentially have more weaknesses or blind spots or different aspects of being that might be more challenging for you. Astrology can also tell us about the future and tell us what the vibe of a moment will be and how that moment might affect you through things like transits and annual perfections and zodiacal releasing. We can get into interpreting the future and how things might play out for you in your career, romantically, all sorts of things. There's also some astrologers who practice things like predicting the weather. There are astrologers who look into astrocartography things, which is like finding out the place that would be the best for you to live or the most constructive for different reasons understands like where might be a place where you experience more love or romantic kind of harmony, or places where you might experience more career success or things like that. So that's another thing that some people do. There's a whole school of astrology called horary astrology, which is a type of divination where you can ask an astrologer a question and then we analyze the chart of the moment that the astrologer understands the question that you've asked and use that to interpret the answer to your question. So that's a form of divinatory astrology. There's also electional astrology, which gets into planning dates. So we look at things like auspicious elections. When is a particularly fortunate time? So because we can see what the quality of the moment is, we can then predict the quality of that endeavor. So if you were starting a business or planning a wedding, then we could choose an auspicious date that would be particularly beneficial for that endeavor. There are also people who practice astrological magic, which I am not very familiar with, but people who do that will do certain practices to sort of harness the energy of different planets so that you can sort of carry it around in like a talisman. So like capturing planetary energy within certain stones or liquids and things like that. Of course, there's lots of psychological astrologers who are using astrology therapeutically to sort of work through mental health and relational things. There's also synastry, where people look into relationships, like, am I compatible? How will my relationship be with this or that person? I also don't really practice this type of astrology too much, but is something a lot of people specialize in. Fertility astrologers, there's also astrologers that focus on health. We can look at health issues in the physical body. That's a whole specialization. And also planning things like pregnancy. My specialty is more around timing things, so talking about the future, and in particular, I'm sort of specialized in career things and getting into purpose and career vocational type of things, figuring out what might be the purpose of your life's work and when you might encounter that and when you'll have certain career peaks or challenges. That's more of what I specialize in. And to close, I will let you know that I do offer consultations in this way. I do either 60-minute sessions that are more just like the birth chart reading, what does your chart say about who you are and your general character and things, get into purpose there as well. And then I do timing, where we get into more of the future and looking at what's coming up for you and things like career peaks like I was talking about. You can also follow me on Instagram and subscribe to me here on YouTube. That really helps me if you want to support my work or get notified when I am making new videos. I have been working through a series on the planets, so I have about half of them done now so far at the time of my releasing this video. And after that, I plan to do a series on each of the zodiac signs, each of the aspects, each of the houses, and I'm open to making lots of more educational videos like this. So if there's anything that you would like me to do, feel free to leave a comment, or if something did not make any sense and you would like a clarification, let me know. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions as well about my consultations. If you're wondering if I might be the right astrologer for you, feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for being here with me at Promethea Astrology. And I hope you have a beautiful day. Be well.